Everybody, welcome back once again to another episode of The Art of Photography. I'm your host, Ted Forbes. Today we're going to talk about black and white photography. Now, I know that is a huge, broad topic, and really it's no different than anything else we've ever done in this podcast, because I do talk a lot about black and white photography. I show a lot of examples there in black and white. A lot of the photographers and kind of, photography lit kinds of podcasts that we've done have been largely on black and white photographers, with a few exceptions, people who at least the majority of their work is done in black and white. One exception to this is when I did an episode on saw lighter, and I'll come back to that in a second, because I want to talk about why black and white. And the reason is I've had, truth be known, I've had a lot of email recently, a lot of conversations with people, and there's even been a thread on Flickr recently on the, in our podcast group. And people have asked me, what really goes into black and white? What kind of thought goes into it? What kind of philosophy? Is it more than just taking a digital image, desaturating it, adjusting the levels, and saying you're done? Well, sure, that works, and there's nothing wrong with that, and you can get a great image that way. But first of all, in historical perspective, let's talk about why black and white exists, or I should probably call it monochrome, which would be the more specific term, because images haven't always been black and white. In the early days of photography, you had a lot of sepia images, were kind of a brown and white, or you had early cyanotype process, which is we haven't talked about it in here, but it's a blue and white process, is what it looks like when the image is printed in the end. And I think throughout all media, so if we look at photography, we look at film, we look at, and I mean film as in motion picture, if we look at magazine production, any kind of printing, magazines, newspapers, books, even computer screens, we've always been technologically dependent on what's available. And monochromatic processes are usually the first ones that come out with visual technologies. If you look at the early computers, the screens were usually black and white or black and green, the early monochrome look. Printers, same way. The early days of the printing press, we had, basically the ability to do one color at a time. And then as technology develops and matures, then, we've discovered ways of finding different, colors as they block off of the spectrum as monochrome, and then bring them together as a multicolored image. And, without getting too much into the details of that, but that's basically how, black and white, why it is what it is today. Early photography was all black and white. Early printing, even up through probably like the 1970s, most newspapers were exclusively black and white, rarely, or if ever, with color. Magazines the same way. Cost is another, factor that comes into that. In the early days of printing, it was cost prohibitive to do things in color, especially things that came out like once a day, once a week, once a month, like newspapers, magazines. It was cost prohibitive to do them in color. You had to print them cheaper so you could get them out at a larger frequency or a more regular frequency. And even today, if you ever have the opportunity to work with a commercial printing press or a commercial printer, there is a big cost difference between a one-color process and a multicolor process. So that has a bearing on things. And so that's a technical reason why we've kind of had black and white as a predominant, I want to say art form, but a proper or a common use throughout history. And then as things develop, I think certainly today we look back in color photography. Look at digital video. We do this podcast every week. I actually have to do work to get the podcast to be black and white if I wanted it to be, just because cameras and everything, they all shoot full color now. So, really now, a lot of times black and white is a choice via the artist. Now, there is an aesthetic quality to black and white as well, and I think that's more important in this day and age, filming this in 2011 and looking back. And personally, and if you're familiar with my work, I shoot a lot in black and white. I do some color, but I really love black and white, and the reason for that is, if you take the color out of an image, and I kind of come, a lot of my inspiration, what I grew up looking at and seeing and what I enjoy are things that come from minimalist schools of design, photography, things like that. So, like last week's a great example. We looked at Hiroshi Sugimoto, and we looked at the, these wonderful seascapes that he'd done. They're just brilliant. And what you have in those is you take out the color, you reduce everything down to just simply the subject, and then shades of light, contrast. It's just basic stuff, okay? So you kind of remove a lot of information from that equation and work from there. And there's just something about that brings an intimacy between the viewer and the subject. And this is just my opinion, and this isn't fact or science or anything like that, but this is why I like to shoot a lot in black and white. And I believe that if you were to ask a lot of photographers who do the same, they would agree that this is really a similar aesthetic. From a technical standpoint, I think there's a lot you can do with black and white. And obviously you can't cover this entire subject all in one 15-minute or less podcast. It's not going to happen. It's just too big a subject. But what I would like to do is start breaking that down over the next couple weeks and talking just specifically about black and white. I know we've looked a lot at that, but let's talk about that, in a very specific sense. There's two ways you can go with this. If you are a digital photographer, there are a lot of methods that you're going to use that involve, and we'll look at some of these, where you take the picture and then that conversion to black and white and then getting it outputted in the end into a print. It's got its own set of techniques, whereas if you still work with film, and I do that as well, there are a lot of techniques with the development process. We can talk about Ansel Adams' zone system, how that works, how that relates to now what HDR photography is. And there's a lot of development techniques. There's darkroom techniques of, they essentially do the same things that the digital process does. It's just they're hands-on, and you have probably a little less control of it, but certainly arguable whether I think it's more fun personally. But anyway, but we're going to talk about some of these processes and why, and what decisions you're going to make with black and white. One of the things that I love about black and white is that you do have a lot of control over the image. There are things you can do, especially when you're getting really high contrast, strange lighting effects that just, for whatever reason, aesthetically don't work as well in color. So if you have blown color highlights and things, they work a little differently than blown black and white highlights. It doesn't mean that either are always aesthetically appropriate, but there are certainly choices you can make with black and white. It's just, it's a different way of seeing things than in color. And so anyway, I know this has been a lot that we've talked about, but really, like what I was saying about coming from kind of this minimalist school, the German post-war design school known as the Bauhaus now, had a concept called the Gestalt. And their concept of the Gestalt was, in a nutshell, it was taking a design, and they were a visual designer, so this could be anything from furniture to logos to a book layout, anything like that. And you reduce it down to the core of what really needs to be there. Okay, this is the concept of the Gestalt. And so, for instance, in your final composition, everything that needs to be there is there, and there's nothing included that shouldn't be there. There's no icing, there's no fluff, there's no extraneous stuff that would get in the way of delivering your message. And I think black and white helps achieve that, or monochrome helps achieve that to a small extent. I think there are images that work really stunning in black and white, but I think if you had color in that same image, it wouldn't work as well. Now, I also believe on the other end that color should be there for a reason. And this is maybe just me and my own opinion. But a while back we did a podcast on a guy named Saul Leiter, and it was an episode entitled Color. I can't remember what episode number at the moment. But it was important to me because when you look at Saul's photos, and he was known during his time as being a black and white photographer, publication career, things like that. It wasn't until later that they discovered all these color images that he'd never done anything with. But his use of color, there's always a reason for that color to be there, and it as a kind of a hallmark or a signature on the composition itself. So for instance, he's got some, you go back and watch the episode, but if you see reds in the image, they work specifically for a purpose. Or if you see like a yellow taxi, and not only are the colors very vibrant, but they're very predominant, they're very simple, and they're there for a reason. And I think that really anything where you're dealing with images, whether it be painting, whether it be photography, whether it be motion picture, film, I think all these choices that you're going to make as an artist, you make for a reason. And anyway, so we're going to explore that in the next couple podcasts. And I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, comments, please join us on Flickr. We have a great discussion forum going on there. It's a great way to get feedback, not only from me, but from other people who watch the podcast. And we've got some very, very talented photographers that participate in there. And I'm absolutely honored that they watch my show. And I'm very humbled that they would join us in the Flickr group. So it's really worth your time. The address on that, the URL, is flickr.com/groups/art-of-photography. And you can also now follow us on Twitter. The Twitter feed for the show is @AOP_podcast. So you can go to twitter.com/AOP_podcast. Or if you want to look my handle up, I'm @TedForbes. So if you're not sure what those Twitter handles are, you can look them up, Google them, figure it out. Usually put twitter.com/ get rid of the @ and put the, I know it's confusing. I'm talking a mile a minute today because I've been ill as of recent. But anyway, we will continue next time. We will have some more stuff to show, some more hands-on. I just kind of wanted to give you an overview philosophy on, basically what the aesthetic of black and white or monochrome means to me personally. And start thinking about that with your own images. Maybe try some black and white and try thinking of how does this absence of color affect your own composition? How does it affect the image? Do you notice anything because you've taken the color away that needs to change in that image? Do you need to be closer? Do you need to be further back? Does the angle need to be changed? Does the depth of field need to change? Does the exposure need to change? All these are things to think about. So, we'll break it down into kind of the digital and film camps and talk about some techniques and kind of how they come together and how they differ in future episodes. But anyway, that's enough for today. And once again, this has been The Art of Photography, and thank you for watching.